Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, host of the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy podcast. The conversation you're about to hear originally appeared in episode 100 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. In this interview, John Joseph Adams and I talk about how we first got into science fiction, how we first met, how we created Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, and what some of our plans are for the future. The interview was conducted by author Matt London. To learn more, visit us at geeksguideshow.com.
Hi, this is Matt, and welcome to a very special episode 100 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is David Barr Kirtley. Dave is the co-host of a science fiction podcast, something called Geek's Guide to the Galaxy on Wired.com. His short fiction has appeared in magazines such as Realms of Fantasy, Weird Tales, and Lightspeed, on podcasts such as Escape Pod and Pseudopod, and in books such as The Living Dead, New Cthulhu, The Way of the Wizard, The Dragon Dunnit, and Fantasy Best of the Year. So, Dave, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be here.
And also joining us is John Joseph Adams, esteemed short fiction editor and the co-host emeritus of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Some of his anthologies include Federations, The Way of the Wizard, The Mad Scientist's Guide to World Domination, and my personal favorite, The Living Dead 2. He is the editor and publisher of the science fiction and fantasy magazine Lightspeed and the horror magazine Nightmare. So, John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
In my duties as guest host, I suppose I should introduce myself as well. I'm Matt London, the author of The Eighth Continent, a series of science fiction novels for children about a brother and sister who must combat pollution, plastic, and paperwork to save the world, coming from Razorbill Books next year. I'm also the creator of Space Pirates in Space, an animated web series about the continuing adventures of a band of bumbling brigands, which you can check out right now at spacepiratesinSpace.com. But my most impressive credential is that this is my 10th appearance on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. So, guys, I suppose that in true James Lipton style, we should begin at the beginning. Where were you born, and when did you first realize you were a geek? Dave?
Okay, so I was born in Philadelphia, while my dad was a professor at UPenn. But shortly after I was born, my parents moved to Westchester. I grew up in a town called Katona. My parents were both research scientists at the IBM Thomas J. Watson lab in Yorktown Heights. And my parents are both big science fiction fans, and most of the books they read to me growing up were fantasy and science fiction books. So I identified as a geek from as early as I can remember.
What were some of those books that they read to you?
Some of the earliest books they read to me were The Hobbit, I remember, and Have Spacesuit Will Travel and Red Planet by Robert Heinlein.
And so because those were just so removed from what you were familiar with from a storytelling point of view, they stood out to you as being unique or special in some way?
Well, sort of the cultural milieu I grew up in was really suffused with the fantastic. I mean, all the cartoons I watched were Transformers and Thundercats and stuff like that, and Voltron. So everything I gravitated toward, both in books and television and movies. Movies I watched were Ghostbusters and Back to the Future, are some of my earliest memories of movies. So really, just everything I was watching was, and that I was drawn to, was always the fantasy and science fiction stuff.
Yeah. Did you find that when you were a kid, those sorts of entertainment were sort of commonly accepted as being cool or popular back when you were younger? Because like the things that you mentioned, right, like Transformers, Ghostbusters, The Hobbit, right? These are huge things that are still, famous and popular today, kind of commonly accepted as being cool or mainstream. But back then, did you feel like there was any sort of like difference between the kinds of stuff that you were interested in, the kind of stuff that either friends at school or people you knew were interested in?
Yeah, maybe not when I was really young. I was not aware of that, but certainly as I got a little bit older, I definitely did get a lot of crap from people sometime. I mean, everyone was into stuff like Transformers, etc., or at least most of the kids I knew were. But if you were too into stuff like that, it was definitely a mark against you socially. In particular, since my parents both worked for a computer company, we were one of the only families that had a personal computer when I was growing up, and people would make fun of you for having a computer. It was like that was just too nerdy. It made you a target for mockery, and it's funny just how things have developed that now you almost can't imagine anyone not owning a personal computer. But things definitely were different when I was growing up.
Yeah. Okay, I have to ask you because you mentioned them both. Transformers or Voltron? You can only pick one.
Oh, I'm more fond of Transformers.
Oh my God, blasphemy! I can't. I can't even. I can't even. Okay. And John, what about you? What was your early geekhood like?
Wow, starting with where we're born, that's some David Copperfield shit right there.
That's right. And yes, indeed. We'll go all the way through it.
Yeah, so I was born in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, which is known mainly for being the town right across the outer bridge from Staten Island. And also apparently the first capital of the state, according to my grandfather. He had Alzheimer's, and so he used to tell me that all the time because he would forget that he told me that. So I will never forget as a result. Anyway, yeah, I mean, sort of like Dave, I mean, when I was a kid, basically looking back on it, almost everything that I was a fan of back then was science fiction or fantasy in some way. I didn't actually really properly identify as a science fiction fan until I was much older. I started working at Walden Books, and I was sort of working my way around the science fiction section. Like I discovered Michael Crichton, and I was reading a bunch of medical thrillers like Robin Cook and stuff like that. So I was reading all this stuff that was really infused with a lot of science, but it wasn't categorized as science fiction, even though Michael Crichton's obviously science fiction. When I was looking around for other things to read that were like that, my brother-in-law at the time, he's no longer my brother-in-law because my sister got divorced, but, he was sort of my guidepost because he had like read tons of science fiction. And so, he recommended to me that I read Mars by Ben Bova, because it's basically a medical thriller in space. And so that was a really good gateway for me. And then, so I read that, and I read I started reading a bunch of other science fiction. I mean, I basically came up with Ben Bova because he was the first science fiction author I discovered. He had all these collections and with his short stories in it, and so he would talk in the editorial notes about editing analog or various other short story magazines and whatnot. And so yeah, I mean, that was sort of how I even heard of a short story magazine.
So it seems like by the time you guys were going off to college, you both were convinced you wanted to host a podcast on geek culture, reviewing the most famed personas in the industry, right? Or
well, no, I mean, by the time we went off to college, there were no podcasts, right?
Right, exactly.
I mean, I first encountered podcasts actually because I had a story. Somebody I did Orson Scott Card's Writers Boot Camp in about 2004 or so. And one of the guys I met there tried to start up an early online magazine. It was called Mech Muse. And it didn't end up working out, but he used two of my stories in that. They only put out 2 issues. But that sort of introduced me to iTunes and podcasts and stuff. And then in subsequent years, I really got addicted to podcasts. And I went through a period where I was just listening to hours and hours a day of podcasts. I'd listened to probably dozens, I don't know, maybe over 100, I don't know.
So, Dave, I'm curious, when did you decide that you wanted to really pursue science fiction as a career? Was it after high school and college, or even later than that?
Well, I mean, I've been writing fiction all my life, and I've been publishing stuff since I was 16. And I always sort of thought I always knew I would do writing or some sort of related creative field. But I always sort of imagined, when you're a kid, you imagine that, I'll be like an astronaut and a writer and a cowboy, whatever. So I thought I would do all sorts of things at once, and that writing would be kind of a sideline. And so in college, I majored in political science. I thought I might do some sort of constitutional law or be a human rights attorney or something like that. And I studied creative writing as well. And I had, when I was a freshman in college, I won it was then called the Asimov Award. It's now called the Dell Magazine's Award for sort of best short story written by an undergraduate college student. And that really got me more into thinking that I might be able to do this in some sort of professional capacity. And when I was a junior in college, I attended the Clarion Writers Workshop and made a lot of really good friends there and sort of got more plugged into the scene. As a result of the Asimov Award, I had gone to my first convention. And so I think it was meeting other people my age who wanted to be science fiction writers and going to conventions that really got me thinking about it more seriously as a profession.
So I actually also attended Clarion about 10 years after Dave did. I hope that doesn't date you too much. But when I was there, I actually went through the archives and uncovered some of your old stories. Do you remember anything that you wrote while you were there?
Oh yeah, sure. Well, I wrote The Blackbird there and The Second Rat and Beauty, all of which were published subsequently.
Hmm.
A couple other stories. John actually published Beauty and reprinted The Blackbird. The ones that weren't published, let's see, I had one that wasn't very good called Vicky, and I had another one that wasn't very good called Black Goo, and another one that wasn't very good called Turk Commander.
Did you write your the Jefferson story while you were there?
No, but that was one of my application stories.
Oh yeah, that was actually the one that I read while I was there.
Okay.
What do you think what effect do you think that writing workshops like Clarion? Well, talk about what Clarion is, and then tell me what impact you think that writing workshops like Clarion have on young science fiction writers or older science fiction writers who attend.
Yeah, I mean, Clarion is a sort of famous science fiction writing workshop. It's a 6-week summer program, and every week a different professional author comes in and works with all the students for that week. There are about 20 students typically admitted, and it's on the base. You'd have to submit. When I did it, it was 2 stories you had to submit to get in, and you work on short story. You're supposed to write one short story a week or so while you're there. And I mean, I think it's a fantastic experience. I would encourage anyone who has the time and resources to do it. I mean, sort of the knock against writing workshops in general is that you can't teach writing, or that it makes everyone write the same. I didn't find that to be the case at all. I think there are certainly things about writing that you can teach. I learned a lot about point of view and structure and even just basic grammar at writing workshops I attended. And I've always had, I think, a very strong voice, and it's hard for me to imagine anything really fundamentally changing my voice, let alone something that happens in 6 weeks. So I'm totally in favor of writing workshops.
Well, obviously, you attended like every one there is.
Yeah, I guess I should say, in addition to Clarion, I attended a whole bunch. I liked Clarion so much, I also attended Odyssey, which is a similar 6-week summer workshop. I mentioned Orson Scott Card's Writers Boot Camp. I attended one called Viable Paradise. I attended James Gunn's writing workshop at the Center for the Study of Science Fiction at the University of Kansas. And maybe even some other ones I'm forgetting about at the moment. But yeah, there were a bunch of them.
And then you got your MFA.
Yeah, and
workshops.
then I also did an MFA at the University of Southern California, where I studied with Irvin Kershner, who directed Empire Strikes Back, and I took a class with T.C. Boyle, who's one of my favorite short story writers. So yeah, I was sort of a workshop junkie for quite a number of years.
You guys are jumping all over my beautifully constructed questions. Like we've just skipped through half of it now. Thanks.
Sorry.
No, it's great actually. So the trajectory I was headed on is that all of this training that you got as a writer, both through independent workshops and the master's program, all of the incredible teachers that you worked with, you then now are a writing workshop teacher. So tell us about that experience.
Yeah, I think 10 years now I've been on the staff at the Alpha Young Writers Workshop, which happens, it's about a week and a half every summer. And in order to apply, you need to be between the ages of, I think, 14 and 19. And actually, I've been doing it long enough now that many of the students from 5 or 6 or 7 years ago are now, starting to get published and establish themselves. And, it's actually, pretty neat because now, they were students and now they're kind of colleagues.
Yeah. So, John, I'm going to come back to you for a bit. What was your sort of professional science fiction journey like after you finished college?
Well, it was in college, and I was taking creative writing classes that I really first even entertained the idea of working in editing. Because I was workshopping stories, and I felt like I had a good sense of how to help writers make their stories better, and my teachers seemed to think so, and the writers seemed to think so. So I was like, oh, maybe that's something I could pursue, because I at the time I wanted to be a writer, and I figured that I would have to get a job on the side like everyone does, and I would write on the side, and I would work the day job, and I figured, well, if I have to do that, at least if I can get a day job that's interesting and would also teach me about writing at the same time, that seems like a win-win, So I was in Florida. I was living in Orlando, or I went to school in Orlando, and so after college, I moved up to New Jersey, where my grandparents lived. Back to the house where I actually lived when I was little. And so I moved in there to help take care of them because they were elderly, and then also I went around looking for jobs in publishing because it was in it was close enough to New York to sort of consider that a viable proposition. And so I basically I decided to apply it to short story magazines because I thought that would be sort of a better way to start, because I figured, oh well, like it seems like more entry level than like a book publisher or something. And so I sent my resume to F&SF and Asimov's and Analog. And I never heard anything from Asimov's or Analog, but Gordon from F&SF actually, he emailed me right away and he said that, oh well, I don't have any openings right now, but you should check back later in the year. So I pursued. This was in 2001. And January 2001, and so I sort of looked around for a job for a couple months, and then in May I followed up with him because I was like, hey, well, it's later in the year now, and I might as well try. And so right around then his assistant gave his notice, so I went in for an interview, and I somehow convinced him to give me the job.
So tell me about the first few months that you were working at F&SF, and what was it like apprenticing under Gordon Van Gelder?
Well, yeah, the first day or so, I remember it was very strange because I was like, I was basically just thrown into the slush pile. And Gordon basically sat down with the slush pile, which was an actual pile because they only take paper submissions. And this was back in 2001. So, I mean, nobody was really doing electronic submissions at the time. But, he just sat down with a couple manuscripts and he's like, and so he like looked at one and he like read like the first two pages and like flipped to the back page and was like, okay, that's it. That's enough. And I was like, oh, okay. Wow, that just blew my mind. I was like, oh, so that's how slush is processed. I was like, I was imagining that, that stories were read all the way through and then the editor decided after that. And I was like, okay, but then once I actually started doing it, I was like, okay, well, that would be madness. Because, I mean, there's no way anyone could possibly do that job for very long if you had to sit and read every single page of a manuscript. But, so, I was, it didn't take me long though to realize that I wanted to do that for a living. Because as soon as I started doing it, I loved it. And, it was, it was hard. It was hard to pass judgment on all those stories, knowing that I would be, sort of breaking the hearts of these writers and whatnot. But I mean, the work was very cool and it was very rewarding. And ultimately it ended up satisfying the creative urge that I had to write. And so instead of, it's sort of working there paralyzed my ability to write, because I think that's something that happens a lot with editors, especially slush readers. But it was fine because I was perfectly happy to devote all my creative energies to editing instead.
So, like, how specifically did working at Fantasy and Science Fiction, like, inform your style as an editor?
I mean, I think working at F&SF actually really helped me develop the appreciation for the more literary type stuff. Because, I mean, F&SF was sort of founded with that idea. Actually, I mean, it's not as clear now because sort of all of the short story magazines are more or less publishing stuff that's, sort of more on the literary side than you would have found like back in the 30s or 40s or something. F&SF was launched in 1949, and it was kind of a reaction to the sort of more plot focused stories that were running in Analog, which I think at the time was still called Astounding, and the other magazines like Amazing Stories and whatnot. And so F&SF was really geared towards the literary side of things. So that's continued to be an important factor in F&SF. And I think, I don't know that I really had as much of an appreciation for that type of story before that. I came up reading Ben Bova, who's, very much an analog type writer. And so, there's not much poetry in his writing. It's very workmanlike and it's very plot focused. And I mean, that's fine. It's just that it's a different type of writing. And so that's probably what I learned most from my time at F&SF.
So when did you first make the decision to edit your own anthology, and how did you go about selecting the authors for it and getting it published?
Well, it all started with post-apocalyptic fiction. After 9/11, I saw this resurgence of post-apocalyptic fiction happening in the slush pile. And I think the slush pile is generally a place where you can detect trends before the public at large is actually aware of them. But in that case, I noticed that happening, and there was this magazine called 3SF. It was a short-lived British magazine, and they had this column called Reader's Guide, and it was sort of, it was sort of a little, it was sort of an introduction to a subgenre, and it had a recommended reading list. And so I pitched them the idea of doing one on post-apocalyptic fiction, and so I did, and so I sold that to them, and so I had to do all this research for it. And when I was doing all that research, I mean, I already knew a lot about it, but I didn't know enough to do this article. And so after I did all this research, I really realized that, well, there's hardly any post-apocalyptic science fiction anthologies. And I was like, well, why is that? How can that be? I mean, it's such a popular genre, or at least it was back in the day. It hadn't been very popular in the 90s. Sort of after the Cold War, it sort of quieted down. Like nobody was really interested in that kind of thing. But then, like I was saying, after 9/11, there was this resurgence, and so I decided I was going to put together a post-apocalyptic anthology, and I knew that it was very unlikely I'd ever get to take over F&SF. So if I was going to ever sit in the big chair, as it were, I'd have to try to do an anthology or something, or I'd have to leave and do something else. So I put together a proposal for an original anthology of post-apocalyptic fiction that didn't sell. But then a couple of years later, Bison Books reissued Beyond Armageddon, which is one of the only post-apocalyptic anthologies that existed back then. And it was a reprint anthology. And so I basically put together the proposal for Wastelands, which became my first anthology, as a spiritual successor to Beyond Armageddon. That's how I ended up selling my first anthology. It was sort of this weird confluence of events.
So, Dave, at what point in this whole process did you and John first meet?
Okay, so John and I met at, there's an organization called the Science Fiction Writers of America, and they have an annual reception, and we met at that. It's kind of a funny story how I ended up going to that in the first place. I was at one of these, I had just been going to conventions, and I kind of been hanging out in New York and going to the KGB readings and getting to know people there. And I was at a convention, and I met an established author, and he learned that I lived in Westchester, and he said, "Oh, well, I live in Westchester too. You should sign up for my mailing list." And so I did. And then through his mailing list, I got an invite to a reading that he was doing at a bookstore in Westchester. And I thought, I normally I have to take the train an hour to get into New York to meet anyone in the literary world. And here's this guy who lives right in my neighborhood, and I'll meet all sorts of other authors and fans in Westchester I never even knew existed. So I went to this bookstore, and there were about 8 people in the audience. And so this author read, and then he says, "Are there any questions?" And the other people in the audience, there's kind of 2 families, I guess. And the father of the first family raises his hand, and he says, like, "How do you get published?" And the author says, "Well, are you interested in publishing science fiction specifically, or just general fiction?" And the guy says, "No, I'm a photographer, and I take pictures of cityscapes, and I want to know how to publish a book of photographs of cityscapes." And this author said, "Well, I wouldn't really know anything about that." And the guy said, "Okay, thanks." And he and his family got up and walked out. Right.
Oh, God.
So
now there's 4 people in the audience.
Yeah, so it's me and this other family. And the other guy the father of the second family raises his hand, and he says, "My question is sort of along the same lines as the last question." And so that guy leaves disappointed with us. So that guy takes his whole family, and they leave disappointed as well. And so then it turns out I'm the only person really who's come to see this author. So I didn't get to meet anyone. There were no fans or other writers in Westchester, which, is not surprising because Westchester is a really boring place. But it ended up not being a total loss because this author said to me, "Are you going to the SIFWA reception on Friday, whatever?" And I had sort of heard about it. I'd never been before, and I really didn't have any particular plans to go. And he says, "No, you have to go. It's the most important thing you can possibly do for your career. If you wake up that morning with like a broken leg and the flu and all this other stuff, you still have to go. It's that important." And so actually I did wake up that morning not feeling so good. And so I wasn't really planning to go, but I sort of remembered he had been so emphatic about it. So I decided to drag myself out to it. And it used to be at the Society of Illustrators. It was this really nice building. And so I was there, and I had been submitting stories ever since I was 14 or so to Gordon Van Gelder, who John mentioned, his boss at the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And I had introduced myself to him at ReaderCon, a few months earlier. And so I saw him. He was one of the few people there who I recognized. So I went up to Gordon and said, "Hi, Gordon. I don't know if you remember me. I'm David Kirtley." And he basically said, "Oh, hi. That's great to see you. Why don't you talk to my assistant?" Because
offloaded you as quickly as possible.
No, right, exactly. And John was his assistant, right? So I started talking to John, and just instantly we really clicked. We just got along. We were sort of on the same wavelength. But we didn't really get that much of a chance to talk at the SIFL reception. I mean, we talked for, I don't know, 20 minutes or something, as I remember. And then shortly after that, John Langan, who we actually just had on the show, organized a conference at SUNY New Paltz. And somehow I got invited to that, and I went to that. And I walked into some panel that was going on, and I saw John sitting kind of in the back by himself, and he just looked very lonely. And I was also very lonely because I didn't really know anyone. So I went and sat and talked to him, and that was really the first time we really had extended conversations, and that's really sort of how we got to know each other. And
John, what was your first impression of Dave?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like he was saying. I mean, we really hit it off, and I think I want to say that when you introduced yourself to me, I remembered that like you had a story in Weird Tales right around the same time or something. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I had a story in Weird Tales in 2002. So yeah, probably that sounds right. Yeah,
right. And like they spelled your name wrong, right? Or like they said Donald instead of David, right?
Basically, in everything I was published in the early days, they had a typo in my name or the title. I think in Weird Tales, they had me as Donald Barr Kirtley because
right.
There was a fairly well known author named Donald Barr who had just died, and I guess he was just on their minds. It was funny actually when that Weird Tales issue was reviewed, they had my name in the review as David Carr Brimley. I actually thought it was kind of badass. I might use that as a pseudonym or something someday.
I like that. So, John, after that, you went on to edit more anthologies while you were still at F&SF, including, you mentioned Wastelands and then later The Living Dead. Did you always have an interest in the horror genre, or was it your experience, like on books like these that led to the creation of Nightmare magazine years later?
Oh yeah, no, it was definitely the experience working in the industry that led me to horror. I'm sort of an accidental horror editor, because I don't know that I ever read a lot of it. I mean, some of the stuff I read was certainly somewhat horrific. I mean, I actually read some Dean Koontz when I was sort of exploring stuff before I settled down into science fiction, and obviously he's a horror author, and I read some Stephen King, but not too much. And it was F&SF is actually one of the reasons that I really grew to love horror, because despite their name, they actually do publish quite a lot of horror. And I mean, you could totally justify adding the third genre name to the magazine if it wouldn't make it even more unwieldy than it already is. But just in terms of because of the amount of horror they do publish. So yeah, I mean, that's where I learned to love horror, was at F&SF, and then doing The Living Dead, and then By Blood We Live. That sort of just helped me, even grow to appreciate it even more. And I mean, Wastelands is sort of horrific. I mean, post-apocalyptic fiction in general is just horrific, to a certain extent. But most people, like, I always think of it as a science fiction genre. And so because that's the perspective I was approaching horror from, I sort of edited The Living Dead more like a science fiction fantasy anthology, even though obviously zombies are considered typically a horror trope. So, I mean, I think that's part of what helped make it so appealing to a wide audience, because I think a lot of horror editors would have approached that with the idea that, oh, zombies are extreme and gross, and like they would go for all the most extreme cases, like you would have found in some of the main text were like the Books of the Dead that John Skip did in the 80s, and some of the stories are really, really graphic and extreme, and I mostly shied away from those, which is funny if you've read The Living Dead and you've read Blossom and Meat House Man, but there's ones that were much more extreme than that. So
well, I mean, I think one of the things that makes that book so popular is that it really does, while it is a zombie anthology, you could say a horror anthology, the stories really do cover a multitude of genres, styles and tones. They're not all Left 4 Dead. Like, compare Dave's story to Kelly Link's story, right? Radically different, both excellent, but very different styles. Let alone, I mean, they're different genres,
Yeah, and I mean that accounts for a lot of the blowback that I got on the book. I mean, there wasn't a ton. I mean, it was pretty universally loved. I mean, except on Amazon, because Amazon reviewers are like that. But a lot of the negative reviews that it got were because of that. Because sort of in response to that, people were thinking of it more as like they knew what zombies were, and I don't really understand zombies, and why do we have all this foo-foo stuff in my zombie anthology? And like complaining about like the Kelly Link story or the Joe Hill story, which I admit, are kind of tangentially related to zombies at best. You know, I mean, they're not they're not really core zombie stories. But I thought, like, hey, people who like zombie stories will like those stories. And if you like zombie stories and you don't like them, what's wrong with you? So,
Yeah. So what's funny is that this is actually the point where I enter the story. Because as a much younger man and aspiring science fiction writer, I'd become well acquainted with John's rejection slip of death, right? And so you were actually hosting a reading at NERSIF, or the New York Review of Science Fiction, featuring stories from the living dead. And Dave was one of the readers. And I remember you were both quite approachable and seemed happy to talk to, a mumbling kid. Although, in retrospect, the conversation would probably have been the extent of our relationship if it weren't for the fact that I brought a pretty girl to the reading with me. The pretty girl in question, of course, lucky for me, would later become my wife. And you guys really took both of us under your wing, introducing us to the whole spec fic community in New York. So my question then is, do you believe that there's something about New York, the city itself, that makes it like the city for science fiction?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think it's just that New York is such a large city and a literary city, and there's just, fantasy and science fiction writers are sparse enough that it's very difficult to find a concentration of them geographically anywhere except New York. There's not, I lived in LA, which obviously is a big city, but there's nothing that I ever found there comparable to the KGB readings or the NERSIF readings, the New York Review of Science Fiction readings. But I mean, at that reading though, where I read my story of the skull-faced boy, and Matt's then girlfriend, now wife, Jordan, came up and started talking to me. It was a really unusual experience because there's this joke that writing poetry and waiting for the public response is like dropping rose petals into the Grand Canyon and waiting to hear the boom when they hit the bottom. And that's kind of what writing short fiction most of the time is like as well. But The Living Dead was this huge best-selling book. It sold, John can correct me if I'm wrong, I think over 100,000 copies. It almost made it onto the New York Times extended list. And so many, or an order of magnitude more people read that story than anything else I'd ever written. I got all sorts of fan mail and fan art. Like people wanted to make movies out of it. It was a crazy time.
Well, it's an awesome story, and I actually find that whenever I don't want to spoil anything in the story, but I find that whenever I'm writing a car crash, I have to force myself not to just rip you off, because I think it's maybe the best car crash scene I've ever read in anything.
And it's like the first scene of the story, so you don't have to read
incident.
far to get to it.
Yeah, you don't have to read far, right? So let's get to the big question, because I think the next big milestone was that in January 2010, an event transpired that, had it not happened, none of us would be here right now. And that event, of course, was the airing of the first episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. So what was the origin of the podcast?
Well, I mean, we mentioned that The Living Dead was this big hit book, right? And John and I, oh my God, we did all sorts of media appearances for it. But one of the media appearances that we did was we appeared on Jim Freund's Hour of the Wolf radio show on WBAI in New York. And I think it's a 2-hour show or something, but we got done and we walked out of there and we're like, we could talk for another 6 hours about this, about this thing, And I forget the exact order in which things happened, but John had been also around the same time, had been talking about maybe making a geek documentary that would have a respectful, that would take a look at science fiction writers and conventions and fans in a respectful way, which had never really been done and which we really wanted to see. And I mentioned that I had become a hardcore podcast addict. And so all those ideas sort of melded together to the idea that we should do our own podcast and we could talk as much as we want and we could, take a respectful look at all these things that we're so passionate about. And John had been writing articles for Tor.com. And so he pitched the then editor, Pablo Defendini, who he'd been playing a lot of Left 4 Dead with. We actually talked about this a little bit back in the first episode, but he pitched him on the idea of us doing a podcast, and Pablo said sure, and neither of us had any sort of experience with radio, theater, audio production, anything like that. So we were learning on the job from the first episode. But yeah, that's how it got started.
And then how did you line up guests for the show, and how did you divine up the tasks of actually producing the podcast?
For lining up the guests, I mean, we would talk to each other and figure out like what kind of guests we wanted to have, and then at some point I kind of took the lead on that a little bit, just in terms of trying to find out when authors have books coming out, so that we can time guests so that it's the best publicity cycle for them. Dave took on the leadership role, but very early on, in terms of he edits all of the audio, and he also comes up with most of the interview questions. Like when we started off, it was like I would be like, okay, well, I'm going to come up with some interview questions and I'll send them to Dave, and then he had already done them all. So I was like, all right, well, okay, well, I'll just let him take the lead on that. And so typically he comes up with most of the interview questions, but yeah, and he took on the leader moderator role as well. So I mean, he was really always the primary guy running the show. And I was always much more of a producer, so it's not going to be that big of a transition, like Dave was saying at the start here, that if I'm more in the producer role, it's not going to be that different probably.
But John had just had the most amazing Rolodex of contacts in the field, because I mean he'd been he'd been the assistant editor. I guess he'd edited a couple anthologies at this point, but he'd also been writing articles for a long time. And I think weren't you doing an interview a week for a while and stuff like that?
No, a day. Yeah. I was doing these interviews for Sci-Fi Wire, which was like the news service of the Sci-Fi Channel, and basically every business day, so 5 days a week, I was interviewing an author every day. And it was like, I mean, their interviews were very simple. They were based on a new book, and I was just using the same questions most of the time, and then I would take their responses and turn them into a little article. But I was doing one of those almost every day, and so because of that, yeah, I mean, I got to be in contact with almost everyone in the field at some point. I mean, because I did that for a couple of years. So I mean, there was several hundred of them, if not more than 1,000. I don't know. I never counted them all up, but I mean, I did a ton of them.
It's really astounding to sort of just look at the episode list and think about how even in just that first season, when you guys had no experience like podcasting at all, the people that you had on the show, like Paolo Bacigalupi, Sherry Priest, Holly Black, and Jonathan Colton, and it's like really remarkable. And if you now, I mean, I can't think of anybody who hasn't been on the show. I mean, maybe George Lucas. You should get George Lucas on the show.
Yeah.
But other than that, like seriously, you've had everybody.
Actually, Neil Gaiman is our white whale.
Yes.
We missed out on him a couple times, and I was like, Neil. But
we'll turn it over to his fans, and we'll say you guys have to pressure him to go on the show.
Yeah,
it would be excellent. Yeah,
and I guess Stephen King too. I mean, we tried to get him on a couple times as well, and we haven't been able to. And those are like two sort of notable omissions from our list. Although I mean, sure, there's plenty. I mean, we've only done 100 episodes, and there's lots of people that are great that we never got around to just because the timing didn't work out for whatever reason. But hey. Still going, so there's still time.
That's right. So what would you say are some of the most memorable or your favorite guests that have been on the show?
I mean, the ones I was the absolutely most excited about to talk to were George R. R. Martin and I think Richard Dawkins. I'd have to look over the list to see, but those were the ones certainly I was the most nervous about going in, or most intimidated by.
I really like those two choices, Dave, because I feel like those two kind of define your personality.
Yeah.
It's like I mean, certainly both titans. And so how did you go about preparing for those interviews? I mean, did you have to sort of like keep the Red Wedding WTF in check? Was that sort of something like a compulsion that you had to cope with, or how did you go about preparing to talk to George Martin?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, I think, because I'm really averse to gushing. And, like when anyone does it, when interviewers do it. So I think I comport myself in a very professional manner all the time, even if it's someone I'm really excited to talk to. Some people have actually complained that I don't seem excited enough. Trust me, I'm squeeing on the inside, people, trust me. But I mean, the thing with George R. R. Martin was I had read and or listened to every interview he'd ever given in his life. So it's not like I had to do much prep for it. But he had actually indicated to us that he would like to talk about something other than Song of Ice and Fire. And so I really took that on as a challenge, that we were going to do the whole interview and just not even mention Song of Ice and Fire, because as we say in the episode, it's episode 22, that I could say anything, anything that he's ever said about Song of Ice and Fire, I could tell you what it was. So we could save that for the second half of the show. But then as it developed, he said, oh, well, no, thanks for covering everything of mine. Now we can talk about Song of Ice and Fire if you want. So we took him up on that.
It's like we proved ourselves to be true Fen, and thus we have the keys to the kingdom.
I'd still like to talk. I'd still like to talk to him about a lot of his short stories that I thought were just even too obscure to talk about, in our one interview with him. But if we ever have him back on, I still have a lot of questions, obscure questions I'd like to ask.
So you actually are. I'm going to out you as like a really big George R.R. Martin fan. Sand Kings is your favorite short story, right?
Yeah.
And is it true that you actually transcribed all of Game of Thrones?
That is true. Yeah.
So tell me about that experience, because that's astounding to me. I forget where I read it, but somebody once gave the writing advice that if you want to learn how to write, transcribe a novel by somebody important, and I can't remember who it is. But it wasn't George R. R. Martin, although that sounds like a really good idea.
Yeah, well, what happened was I mentioned I was at the Odyssey Writing Workshop in 2001, and at that time I really had some basic mechanical issues regarding fiction that were eluding me, in terms of point of view in particular, in terms of writing what characters were thinking from a third-person point of view. And Jean Cavellos, who is the leader of that workshop, really hammered me on stuff like that. And she suggested this exercise where you should take a short story that you like and retype the whole thing, and just pay attention to everything about how it's written, where the commas are, where the periods are, how long the sentences are and what their structure is, etc. And she also asked us to name our favorite short story, and I had listed Sand Kings by George R. R. Martin as my favorite short story. And there's this other guy at the workshop, Danny Linus, who had also listed that as his favorite short story. So, of course, we really hit it off. And he was a big fan of Song of Ice and Fire and told me I had to read it. And I was really disillusioned with epic fantasy at that point, and I hadn't read any in several years. But since we were obviously, our tastes were in accordance with each other, I went ahead and read it and just absolutely fell in love with that series. And it just seemed to me that if I thought to myself, if transcribing a short story is good, doing a novel would be even better. And here's a novel that just seems to me to be firing on all cylinders. If I were to do this whole book, I felt at the time I would know everything I'd ever need to know about basic mechanics of writing a novel. And so I sat down, and I felt like I already spent enough time typing. I didn't want to do any more typing. I didn't want to get any more carpal tunnel type stuff than I was already risking. And so I figured I'd do it by hand. And so I sat down and I did about the first 4 or 5 pages by hand. And my hand had cramped into this horrible shriveled claw thing. And I looked at the whole book and I thought, this is impossible. Let me just do the first 100 pages. And so I kept going. I did the first 100 pages. I finally got to the point where I could do 10 and then I think 20 pages at a stretch. And I got to 100 and I figured, let's go for 200, and sort of I ended up doing the whole book.
So what do you think was the biggest discovery that you made during that process?
Oh, I learned a lot of stuff. In terms of point, the biggest thing was just how much detail there was. My writing tends to be very stripped down and spare, and just to see how long a paragraph of description could be, and just a lot of stuff about the way that pronouns are handled, and point of view. Pronouns and point of view were the big things that I was really focused on going through that.
Yeah, it's one of the things that stands out to me about his writing as well in those books, just like how they are page turners like sparse writing, but are so packed full of detail and long passages of description that I still can't really wrap my head around how he manages to construct it in a way that allows it to be so breezy, but also really dense and full of interesting stuff. So I'm curious, that sounds, so those all sound like very pleasant memories about interviewing people for the show, but tell me about some of the challenges. What have some of the hardest things been about making the show?
Well, there's one interview guest that who will remain nameless that ended up not actually appearing on the show because the interview just didn't go well at all. And by the time we were finished with the interview, we're like, we can't air that. And even though Dave is a total wizard when it comes to editing audio, there was like no way we were going to be able to save that one into, because Dave did his usual due diligence, making all these interesting interview questions, but the guy he didn't have anything interesting to say about any of the like, it's like I never really encountered anyone who just didn't really have anything to say about this process.
Was it hostile, or was he just boring?
No,
I think he may have been high.
No, it's like John was saying. He was just obviously a very intuitive person and couldn't say anything analytical about his process, and so it's always kind of boring just to hear really highly intuitive people talk about their process, because they just do it and they don't know how they do it.
Well, what about the technical side of it? Have there been any near miss catastrophes?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, the internet, like dealing with the internet, is the absolute worst part of doing a podcast that relies on interviewing people over the internet, right? And so, I mean, the thing that comes to mind for me is, we interviewed Ellen Kushner, and she told us before the interview starts that she had a sore throat, and so could we keep this as short as possible? And we're like, of course, that's totally understandable. And so I asked her, could you just give us a little bit of the history of the Border Town series? And she opened her mouth, and instantly my internet died. And so I was like, no, and it was down for about 10 minutes, and finally it came back up, and I got everyone back on the phone. And she says, so how much of my answer did you get?
None of it.
And I said, well, none of it. And she's like, oh, I've been talking for 10 minutes, And so that was like one of the most, the times I felt the worst.
Please.
I was going to say, when we interviewed Neil deGrasse Tyson, we just had a terrible, terrible internet connection. And there are parts in that interview where I literally had to take words, from different parts of the interview and stitch them together into sentences to have some of the things he said be comprehensible.
Yeah, actually, it was a bit of a contributing factor to me actually deciding to step down, because I was having just like constant internet problems over here, and it's just like my connection would be the cause of all of the problems with our Skype calls. And I think I finally got it sorted out now, but I mean, it really was so frustrating that it was just like, I should just stop doing this, because it's like I'm ruining everything for everyone else too.
Well, and when we record the panels, we ask all the panelists if they can to record their own audio, and then I can, put those together on separate tracks, and then you don't have to worry about the internet speeds as much. But then people never get their thing. They screw up recording it somehow, or they don't get it to me on time, or I'm sitting around, or they send it to and it's all effed up somehow. And the technical stuff is definitely
the hardest part.
Is the most time consuming and just maddening part of doing a podcast.
Well, and even though I've done this 100 episodes now, I still manage to do really big screw ups on occasion. Like, we just did a panel the other day that Dave actually ended up having to cut me out of completely because my audio was completely screwed up. Because I was trying like a new setup, and I was like, okay, well, my microphone wire is actually trapped, and I wanted to move it. And so I was like, okay, I'll just mute my mic, and then I'll untangle this, and then I'll plug my mic in once it's unmuted. But then I screwed it all up doing that, and just like ever since that point, I like screwed up the whole audio. So, yeah. So even people who should know better manage to screw up stuff all the time.
It's funny to think about all of your favorite authors struggling with crappy internet connections. It just for some reason it seems very like the president going to the bathroom sort of thing. Like, you don't think about these sort of like public figures being having to deal with the same sort of like bad Wi-Fi that we have to deal with.
Yeah. Well, and I think especially since we're on Wired, people assume that we have far more resources than we actually do. And we've actually had guests say like, oh, is this going to be over the phone, or should we go to your studio? And like, no, trust me, there's no studio, So, and a lot of things people complain about in terms of people will complain about stiltedness or like weird gaps in the conversation or stuff. Like 99% of the time, there's some technical problem that's the cause of that. It's not that we're like that we just don't know how to talk,
Although we are geeks.
Although we don't know how to talk.
What would you say what do you think is the funniest moment that's ever occurred in either one of the interviews or in the process of making the show?
I mean, I'm sure there must be plenty of funny things. I mean, I know the Ryan North interview was hilarious. And that one's coming to mind because it was fairly recent. But I mean, I really enjoyed talking to him, and I like loved his book so much. And And of course he does a webcomic, so I assumed that he would be funny to talk to in person, but it's like, you know, you're never really prepared for how funny somebody might be in person compared to how they are on the page. And so, yeah, I mean, that one was really funny. I mean, it's in terms of just sort of some random thing that happened. I don't know. That's a big question. Anything come to mind, Dave?
Well, I mean, I think our interview with Brian Dunning back in episode 5 of
Mm-hmm.
Skeptoid, I think that was one of our that was a certainly that when I listened to that the first time, that was like one of the first episodes that we did. I thought was really funny, and our discussion about Bigfoot and UFOs and stuff like that
Mm-hmm.
is really funny. Actually, speaking of the Ryan North interview, though, I have an outtake from that that's absolutely hilarious because there was just a gigantic thunderstorm going on outside my window during that interview. And I was able to edit it out. But if you listen to the unedited version where we're just trying to talk and there's just like super loud lightning bolts going off every 10 seconds, I'll make that available at some point. It's pretty entertaining.
It's like an omen.
So, guys, I'm going to ask you this is my final question, which is, what can we expect from the next 100 episodes of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, things are sort of up in the air right now. I mean, I don't actually. I mean, we're thinking about maybe doing a Kickstarter sometime early next year, and depending on how that goes, that will probably determine how many episodes we do in 2014. Because I mean, it's a lot of fun to do the show, and it's so, like I said, it's such a thrill to be able to talk to people on the phone like George R. R. Martin and Richard Dawkins, and I love getting feedback from fans and so on. But it's as maybe you've heard, it's an incredible amount of work on the technical side doing a show like this, and especially reading all the books and prepping for it. And it's definitely, after 100 episodes, reaching an unsustainable level of time, time invested to money to support my life coming out of it. So yeah, I think really it's hard to say at this point. But yeah, probably fan support will play a key role in determining how frequently we release episodes next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think if iTunes sort of got with the program and made something that would let you charge something for podcasts, at least in some capacity, that would probably go a long way towards making podcasts more sustainable. Because it does seem kind of ridiculous that at this point, you can self-publish almost anything now, including music, but there's no way to charge for a podcast. I saw recently there's a new crowdfunding platform called Patreon, which is sort of like Kickstarter, except that it's very focused towards serial type projects. So something like a podcast would work, where people sign up and they pledge a certain amount every month or every week or whatever it is. And so they can be a patron that way, as opposed to just buying like one thing when you're doing a Kickstarter. So I mean, something like that might help. But although, like Dave said, we're planning to maybe do a Kickstarter next year. I mean, otherwise I suspect the show is going to be much the same as it's been, continuing to get more awesome, because I think the longer, I mean, except that I won't be there, but because the thing is, as you continue to build a show like this, the more big guests you have on there, the easier it is to get even bigger guests. And so, like, at this point, it's like, I think like we've interviewed enough huge authors that we should really be able to get almost anyone, and it's just a matter of time before we get somebody like Neil or Stephen King or maybe some of the movie people that we'd love to interview. It's like plus the association with Wired.com, it really helps out for that. So I think the sky's the limit to what Geek's Guide can do. It's just a matter of how sustainable is it going to be with Dave's
Yeah.
Dave's workload.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if you've listened since the beginning, you'll see the format has changed a little bit in terms of, we've introduced the guest geeks and then having on 2 or sometimes even 3 guest geeks, and I think that's really added a lot to the show. And like I said, we had absolutely no experience doing this when we started, and I almost feel like the first 100 episodes were kind of practice, and it's like, okay, now we're kind of getting the hang of this and getting more comfortable interviewing people, and learning how to moderate a panel with 4 or 5 people and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I really think we could, we can continue to polish things up and make the show more and more, professional sounding and, of interest to the community going forward.
Well, guys, I want to thank you for indulging me and my desire to interview the two of you on this special occasion. Thank you for letting me be a part of this whole awesome experience, and congratulations again on 100 awesome episodes of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah, thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Thanks for coming on the show 10 times.
Here's the 10 more in the next 100.
And that was our panel. So hope you enjoyed it. To learn more, visit us at geeksguideshow.com. Thanks.